Commonly within conservation, we speak of invasive species and the harm that invasive species cause. So in a little bit more detail, what is an invasive species? This is something that has usually been introduced into an area through human means, directly or indirectly. It's not a species that naturally occurs within that area. And the invasive part is referring to the fact that these species will propagate and take over and usually have a negative impact on the environment or the ecosystem that they've been introduced to. So these can be plant species, these can be animal species. When we think of plants, invasive plant species, they propagate and they overtake native and endemic species. Usually they can grow quicker. They can outcompete native and endemic species for resources. And so you have this process called habitat degradation, where invasive plant species gradually take over and choke out native and endemic plant species, slowly degrading the habitat, making it more monotypic, meaning that this habitat is less biodiverse. There's one or two species are overrepresented within the habitat. And the harmful impact of this degradation is that you go from a habitat which is biodiverse, which is full of different structural environments, niches, different food types, to an environment which is dominated by a few individual species, which only provide a certain number of these niches, a certain number of food resources. So in terms of native and endemic plant species, they're outcompeted, they are choked of resources, and so they do not propagate. And eventually we see that native and endemic species, they gradually become less and less common and eventually can go extinct. And for endemic and native animal species, which might rely on these endemic and native plant species, this is going to have a negative impact on them. They may not have the correct species that they require for nesting or for feeding on. A good example within Mauritius is that we have lost a lot of our cavity-producing species, which are important for birds such as the Echo Parakeet that rely on cavities to nest and lay their eggs in. And then similarly for pink pigeons and for Echo Parakeets, a loss of native and endemic plant species might mean that the forest they inhabit is less biodiverse, and so they have less food resources available to them throughout the year. An animal invasive species, a classic example is the rat. This can have a major negative impact in that it can predate native and endemic species. Within Mauritius, with our smaller bird species, rats will be a big problem for actually coming into the nest and eating their eggs. And this eventually has a large impact on the population because they cannot breed, and so they can't propagate, and so the population is not viable over time. But rats also can affect plant species. They will feed on seeds, they will feed on regenerating plants, and this is going to stop your native and endemic plants regenerating and be a further impact on your forests. So this is the reason why a healthy ecosystem is essential for conservation to be effective. If we're trying to recover a rare species, we need a healthy ecosystem. So we need the resources that they need to be available for them in the environment. A destroyed or damaged or degraded habitat does not provide the resources that these animals require. Here in the Mauritian Wildlife Foundation has to be combined with forest restoration so that we can provide these resources to these animals and to these plant species that we work with. And in the long term, it's essential. We need healthy ecosystems for our work to be successful in the future. And supporting our species, doing the conservation work that we do, is slowly restoring endemic and native populations. It is slowly restoring ecosystems, but moving forward, we need to take great care that we do not introduce more invasive species to Mauritius. We need to take measures to stop invasive species populations growing within Mauritius. We have many issues with monkeys, crows, rats. Many species have been introduced to Mauritius, so it's very important that we take steps to control those populations, to protect our endemic species and to protect our ecosystems.